everyone. My name is Svetlana Stevenson, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's Interdisciplinary Research Forum's event that has been organized together with Creature, the Center for Creative Arts, Cultures and Engagement. The topic of today's event is collecting and representing global culture in museum. And this event has been convened by Professor Wesi Ling, a professor of transcultural arts and design at the School of Art, Architecture and Design in our university. Thank you very much, Wesi, for suggesting and organizing this fascinating event. And I will now give the floor to you to introduce the research series that you run and to chair today's workshop. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Stevenson, and good afternoon, everyone on board. We are delighted to host the event with our University Interdisciplinary Research Forum, and thank you again, and Professor Gary McLean for the invitation. I'm Ling, the Director of Creature. I will moderate this session. During our can leave questions in the chat box. We will respond to them in the Q&A time towards the end of the session. Today's event is the last part of Reorienting Cultural Creativity in this academic year, a series on the tactics of resistance in institutionalized establishments and post-colonial processes of globalization. In an attempt to add new prospects and visions to the existing setup of art and culture, the series readdresses the balance for an actor-oriented approach. The series brings together art, design, and cultural historians, curators, artists, and researchers in the humanities whose work concerns art and culture, mythology, and creative industry in asymmetric society and post-coloniality. You can find recordings of our past events in this series in the past event tab on Creature website. Today, our forum on collecting and presenting global culture in museum brings together Dr. Christine Chinczynska at the Victorian Albert Museum, Amanda Pinoff at Stedelijk Museum, and Dr. Harriet McCabe at London Metropolitan University. We will begin the forum with Christine, then myself, followed by Amanda and Harriet. Time permitting, we will engage ourselves in a conversation before taking questions and comments from the audience. Dr. Christine Chinczynska is Curator of African and African Diaspora Fashion at the Victorian Albert Museum. Her work considers cloth, culture, and themes such as colonialism and international trade. Christine worked with IFA, including cloth, fabric, which explores us and social processes. She has held academic and research positions at Goldsmiths, the University of London, and University of Johannesburg, the Viet Research Centre. In 2016, she gave a TED talk that explained fashion as everyday activism, in which she coined the phrase craftivism. Amanda Pinoff is design curator at the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam, where she makes exhibitions that today's society and social mental concern. Her doctoral studies look at Indonesian objects entering to the Netherlands during the colonial years to contest the love of young people self-identified as Indonesian. He is also the co-founder of Design Museum Mumbai, a Normandy exhibition space showcasing local talent and taken as a tool for social change. She has presented, curated, and produced many international projects and exhibitions, including Brooklyn Nature Triennale Milano, Le Grand Palais in Paris, Salon des Mobiles in Milan, the New Institute in Rotterdam, the School, among Dr. McKay, senior lecturer and coordinator of critical contextual studies for interior at the School of Art Architecture in London Metropolitan University. She She is a curator and academic with a specialism in interior design history. She worked at Apartheid Museum, London, and was curator at the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts in Norwich. McCabe opened and ran the National Trust's first modern movement property to be made available to the general public. Her current research interests include centuries and material culture and the impact of attire on the region's visual culture. Without further ado, I hand over to Dr. Christine Chinczynska to begin our forum. Christine, over to you now.
Thanks, Wessie. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So, as the V&A's inaugural curator of African and African diaspora fashions, I now find myself with a key role in managing and growing the global reach of our collection, ensuring that our fashions and textiles are better represented in the museum's permanent collections, the fashion gallery, and also in our popular exhibitions. My position represents an exceptional opportunity to direct the collection beyond its existing rather limited holdings of textiles and fashions created by those of African heritage. I'm actively researching contemporary fashion creatives across the corners of the continent and the fashion spectrum, with a view to acquiring important iconic works for inclusion in our forthcoming Africa Fashion exhibition, which is scheduled to open in June 2022. So today I want to speak about what I bring to this role. I want to speak about collecting and curating from a perspective that is infused with a viewpoint that reflects my position within the global majority. I want us to think about the textures of this historical moment. Is it really extraordinary, or are we just witnessing the galvanization of centuries of protests against the relegation of certain people like me, to the bottom of society's hierarchies of value that are rooted in negative readings of racial and cultural difference? I'm going to share a personal story to a great extent, and it's a personal story about the daily process of reversing the colonization of minds that Frantz Fanon alerted us to, and about the ongoing wrestle with what W.E.B. Du Bois defined as double consciousness. And I'm also going to speak about in-between borderlands, almost diasporic ways of thinking. And in doing so, I'm going to invoke scholars such as Homi Bhabha, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Stuart Hall. And these are the scholars that have given me ways to articulate my thoughts on issues such as structural racism, the representation of blackness, notions of belonging and unbelonging, hypervisibility and invisibility. Importantly, representing global cultures in museums is not about making exhibitions and adding African and African diasporic artifacts to archive. It's about changing minds and changing structures. I'm always conscious of the frantic activity around ways of doing inclusive, equitable museum work. Yes, this is important, but sometimes it pays to stop, be still, and reflect. I fear that some moves taken in haste can inadvertently replicate systems of colonialism to the mining of knowledge from consultants and volunteers of colour without due respect, perpetuating an imbalance of power. So how can we open out acquisition policies? How can we tell layered, multivocal stories from existing archival objects? Prior to joining the V&A, much of my research examined the connection between fractured African diasporic narratives, post-colonial life writing, and creative making. I've always been interested in the connections and disconnections between personal archives and received histories, between public, private, and intimate archives, how neglected or hidden diasporic histories can be mapped through objects such as textiles or other everyday things. Over the course of my research, I formulated a methodology shaped partly by the bits and piecesness of Joan Anim-Addo's carnivalizing theory and echoing Bell Hooks's mobilization of the crazy quilt as a metaphor to speak about the stitching together of Black histories from fragments. I myself have previously used the Jamaican proverb, every mickle make a mockle, meaning every little adds up, to describe this process. The Jamaican pitchy-patchy John Canoe costume on the screen visually captures this idea of bits and piecesness, and some may know that pitchy-patchy sits at the head of the carnival and sets the tone and somehow oversees and creates scant order, I guess, but I wanted to say order out of disorder, but actually embraces disorder and sees that as a creative thing and a way of thinking. You see, the travelling community that is the African diaspora, my community within the global majority, could be viewed as a home of disorder, as a home of diversity, as a home of syncretism. Its cultural expressions, its histories are fragmented, creolized. And herein lies the problem of what methods can be used to narrate our artefacts. Herein lies the problem of how to collect and curate. Considering acquisitions and exhibition making, adopting ready-made models on which to hang our curatorial strategy is impossible and ill-advised, particularly if they are steeped in global North perspectives. We simply can't do what we always do. And I'm really drawing on or invoking Audre Lorde's words here, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So for me, there has to always follow a search for a model or models that encourage the coexistence of multiple tools. Boundaries have to be negotiated. And I want to emphasize this notion of coexistence and negotiation because I never advocate a throwing out of Western theory or the masking of our colonial past in my conceptual work. Instead, I choose to go a piece of the way with them, to cite Carol Boyce Davis. Going a piece of the way with them is a model for negotiating relations with strangers, and it's founded on an African tradition whereby the host goes a piece of the way with a stranger or friend before returning home. The distance travelled depends on the closeness of the relationship between the two or more parties. When used as a means of engaging curatorial methods, for example, it becomes a metaphor for critical relationality, where a number of positions are examined for their efficacy to the exploration of the question or topic under focus. Critical relationality has an inherent sense of fluidity, almost an inbuilt homelessness that mirrors that of the diasporic experience. It suggests a complex, integrated approach, one that resists binary oppositions whilst challenging hierarchies of value and the privileging of Euro-centric viewpoints or master discourses. It encourages dialogue instead of separation or essentialism and aims to be conscious of the plural self and the diverse other. In essence, the approach that I'm bring to collecting and curating is rooted in my cultural background, since being in diaspora involves fracturing of one's perception of self, of one's sense of belonging, of the notion of historical continuity. But it also involves setting up a metaphorical home in the in-between space of possibility, one that is comfortable with the slipperiness and shape-shifting nature of the meaning of things. The approach that I bring is characterized by a willingness to embrace flux, to negotiate ongoing transformations from within and outside. In my opinion, to be in diaspora is to live in a world where new knowledge and new ways of seeing that challenge pigeonholes and blind spots can be spun into a yarn of one's own. We can take ownership of the stories told about us through the objects with which we engage. We can decenter familiar Euro-centric starting points that often leave our voices out. People of colour are in the global majority, and it's crucial that we see ourselves represented in exhibitions staged by leading cultural institutions, including my own. A shift in priorities is long overdue. So how does this look in practice? And this brings me to Africa Fashion. Opening in June 2022, Africa Fashion will showcase the irresistible vitality, creativity and innovation of a range of groundbreaking designers, design collectives, stylists and photographers working in Africa today. The contemporary African fashion scene is as diverse and dynamic as the people of the continent itself. And we hope to share a glimpse of the glamour and the politics of that scene with our visitors. The route into this visually compelling narrative will be provided by an essential overview of the African independence and liberation years, so the mid to late 1950s to 1994, and this will be done through the intimately connected practices of fashion, music and visual art. The radical social and political reordering that took place sparked a cultural renaissance across the continent, laying the foundations of today's fashion revolution. Importantly, the exhibition will tell the story of fashion as a self-defining art form, a kind of movement culture that reveals the richness of African histories and cultures. The narrative that we aim to share is also a story of agency and unbounded creativity, one of abundance rather than lack. All too often, the story told about the continent is a negative one. All too often, the story being told is one of lack. It's as though only one story is allowed to exist. Considering the framework of the museum, taking note of global North perspectives and acknowledging the closeness between whiteness and power, if we still ourselves and if we see what's at play, it becomes crucial to ask who is included in the we, the us, and the our. If in the past we've left Black experiences out, could the evolving approach that I'm beginning to share become a way of moving forward? Moving forward and looking back simultaneously? Can we revisit and reconcile the past through layered reanimation whilst going forward in an equitable manner? Can we embrace a broader we? On Africa Fashion, we're foregrounding multiple African voices, and geographically we're taking a corners of the continent approach that blurs artificial, outmoded colonial boundaries between North and South, East and West, since creativity knows no borders. Now, I think it's important to draw on expertise from various communities under focus when exhibiting global cultures, remembering that expertise comes in many forms. So for us, that includes the designers themselves, academics and researchers from the region, community representatives, audiences, object users. We have to recognize that knowledge resides outside the institution as well as within it. Conversation is important, listening is key. I see myself as a facilitator, someone that allows others to speak, and I think that mutual respect can be built in this way. I'd suggest that this is a good way forward for institutions. It's a good way to begin. On Africa Fashion, we've been having ongoing conversations, fashion creatives, academics, critics, wearers, young creators of colour here and on the continent. We're setting up community panels. We're having a youth co-design group. So these conversations will inform the objects that we include in the exhibition and the stories that we tell about them, the way that we narrate them. We're not following the preoccupations of the global North. We want a particular language of fashion to emerge, one that does not look to the global North for approval. We hope that foregrounding African perspectives, voices and concerns will assist in a shift in the geography of fashion. All of these elements, the bits and piecesness that I describe, come together to trouble stereotypical notions of Africa and Africans, to push against a single story rooted in a reductive colonial North perspective. There is more than one way to be Black and African and fashionable. The continent has many stories to tell about itself, its histories and its cultures. As a museum, Africa Fashion will allow us to explore new strategies for collecting and representing global cultures, recognizing the broader we, the broader us, the broader our. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. That's really wonderful, very rich piece, and I'm sure that we will have a lot of discussion after all our presentations. So we're not taking questions at this point, but you are very welcome to leave your comments in the chat box along the way. So we will pick them up towards the end of the session. So I am going to put myself in. So I am the second presenter. So Maeve, would you be able to put up my slides? Thank you. I'm going to talk about collecting and representing global culture in the museum, but particularly focus on global fashion. For the field of fashion in recent times has become a major topic of research in social and cultural theory, bringing to view a whole arena of new cultural issues. This is especially true for the complex dynamics of global fashion. Global thinking requires the disciplines of fashion to challenge one the hierarchy to see impurity of styles and movements. Existing narratives of fashion production and creation have shifted in the wake of transnational realities towards a more complex picture of global interconnections. Not only is the rest a diverse composition of many voices, it is also a source of many different ways of responding to a ubiquitous desire and need to participate in global fashion. In general, globalization is not the reception of a dominant meaning by a subdominant culture, but rather the construction of meaning in the interaction between cultural values and the objects circulating in cultures. Likewise, global fashion under the rubric of globalization is not a standard or stationary topic, but rather a methodology for analyzing the new facade of fashion in the 21st century. For most fashion theorists, global fashion is not simply about the global dissemination of dress and fashion. Neither does it point to a stylistic form of dress in a given locality, nor should it be defined merely as brand circulation or the international expansion of Western fashion. It expands on my work with Serge Rinach on fashion making in China, through which intrigues multiple layers of world encounters and cultural dynamics. We propose the use of global fashion as a conceptual framework, an interconnecting force typified by multiple encounters of world cultures and the transcultural. Beyond a single style or stylistic look, it would only be appropriate to consider global fashion's capacity to interconnect the world, circulate people, goods, and ideas, and map out multiple cultures and identities. That global fashion brings out multi-layered encounters between the subjects and its outside world, often goes beyond the dichotomy of Orientalism and Occidentalism. The outcomes are therefore necessarily transcultural and essentially hybrid, offering distinctive stimuli for reimagination, and they are often underscored by co-creation. In examining global fashion as a possible tool in the conceptual and everyday handling of museum artifacts, I took the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands as a case in point, through which archival research findings are analysed to underpin global histories and explore global fashion as a conceptual framework for museum practice. I conducted qualitative research via an internal workshop during my fellowship with the Research Centre at the Museum on Global Fashion and Narrative in the Ethnographic Museum. 16 museum curatorial professionals took part in assessing global fashion as a tool for museum practice in an ethnographic setting. The aim of this study is to propose global fashion as an interdisciplinary conceptual framework for museum practice in, but not exclusive to, the dress and textile venues. Through focus group discussions with curatorial professionals at the museum, we analyze the conceptual framework of global fashion, the possibility of incorporating it in museum practice. It is understood that new meanings for otherness is of critical attention in the ethnographic setting of the museum. Sitting alongside the current decolonial movement, global fashion, as outlined by the participants, can decenter the Euro-American system and offer inclusiveness in fashion. Such points of view are seemingly aligned to the recent effort of fashion scholars who have proactively situated fashion within global histories so that its emergence can be traced across the world. According to the participants, it is necessary to reframe how clothing is perceived, question fashion's ambiguous operation between inclusion and exclusion, and challenge the notions of style versus fashion in the ethnographic context. Outside of the material culture, global fashion can be used to reflect global culture and iterate global citizenship, with its expected position of world view. To many, fashion is subjective, causing opinions to form, as well as often disagreements. On the other hand, it is an accessible language, enabling discussion on the environment and societal issues. Deeming global fashion as a subject of examination not only widens the Euro-centric approach of fashion theory, but also actively engages a wide range of audiences with social cultural phenomena. However, it is not to simply imply that we accept the face value of fashion without recognizing its unfavorable condition. The topic of fashion is often considered fruitless, ambiguous, and unworthy of serious attention. At times, it is also gender. Fashion exhibitions generally entice more female than male audiences. It could alienate many who feel the pressure to conform or are not interested in beauty and appearance. Performability and actor nature are often separate from reality. The level of expectation of a fashion exhibition has in recent years been raised drastically when blockbuster shows are staged in key American capitals. That allure, excess, and fantasy are expected by most could equally place pressure on investment in fashion exhibitions. What it is the potential, well, it has the potential to engage with potential global issues in a meaningful discussion. This rings true to those museums that are new to fashion exhibitions. Outside of the Euro-American canon, museums in authoritative regimes seem to take fashion not only as a resource to fashion exhibitions, but also as a tool for cultural diplomacy. For instance, in spite of being China's largest textile and clothing themed museum, the China National Silk Museum in Hangzhou has acquired a massive collection of almost 70,000 clothing and fashion objects from all over the world. Nevertheless, it favors tourist fashion exhibitions than own curatorial shows. The first national museum dedicated to silk in China, blockbuster exhibitions such as Dior by Dior 1977 to 1957, introduced from the Royal Ontario Museum in 2019, and Balenciaga Shaping Fashion tour from the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2020, are staged to drive footfall, generating revenue to the museum. The museum's official commitment is to promote Chinese clothing culture overseas by organizing exhibition for designs, inviting over 100 designers from 24 regions to partake. Fashion is tasked as cultural diplomacy for the museum to increase international influence. While Euro-American museums have begun to problematize fashion, if not global fashion, as a means of engaging with contemporary and societal issues, as well as addressing decolonisation, new colonial countries are not necessarily aligned with the decolonised initiative. Global fashion is a cycle and a matter of people, objects, cultures, global histories, and contemporary debates increasingly threaded across museums around the world. Subjectivity, however, is not an option. A case in point here is the new fashion and textile gallery at the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore. Diaspora is the key word to a multiracial population comprising of a sizable ethnic Chinese, Malays, and ethnic Indians. Intra-Asian dynamics has been promoted for societal harmony. The arrival of the museum director took it a priority. Fashion has instantly turned into a solving agent. The museum delves into hybrid Chineseness in Peranakan's clothing. Global trade and cross-cultural interactions were the backbone of the 10 shipwreck collections exhibition. However, when the exhibits were staged in Shanghai Museum, the focus was exclusively on luxury and craftsmanship. All conjure up a necessary step for the Singapore's premise of the Asian venue, to which its advocates respond to the strong assertions of state sovereignty. The technical role of fashion in Asian Civilization Museum, thus established, then provides the basis for a for the legitimacy, if not the superiority, of a favored political, social, and cultural argument or practice, the paternalistic. To sum up, a cyber method of inquiry, global fashion as a conceptual framework enables the reactivation of a new energy to be injected into existing museum collections of past times. As demonstrated in the workshop, it can apply to narrate, curate, and exhibit artifacts in the Ethnographic Museum. Its usage can apply to museums with a fashion collection, as cultural underpinning of fashion style. The usefulness of global fashion is its ability to retell global stories, refocus the agenda, and recenter preconceived power in the institutional hierarchy and the relation to otherness. It can also address societal issues and is taken to serve part of the political agenda as a tool for cultural diplomacy, especially museums under authoritative regimes. The operation of fashion in various museum practice can be manifested in collection, narrating, displaying, curating, and exhibiting fashion and textile artifacts is a case in point for future research. I'm going to stop here, and I'd like to invite Amanda as our third presenter. So, Amanda, over to you now.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for having me and for the introduction. Maeve, if you can please share my presentation. Thank you. And I'm just going to switch off my camera for the connection. So as Wesley just said, I'm the co-founder together with artist Jorge Mañez Rubio of Design Museum Dharavi. It was the first museum of its kind, and it was based in the homegrown neighborhood of Dharavi, which is in Mumbai in India. And it showcased local talent through a nomadic exhibition space and employed design as a tool to promote social change and innovation on a global scale. But also, in addition, we were constantly challenging the boundaries of what a museum could be. So today I want to tell you a bit more of what we've done, what we've learned, and what this design as a discipline can mean in the future. So Jorge and I came up with this idea of the museum, but of course we worked together with a lot of different people, especially with Rahul and Matthias from URBS. This is an experimental action and research collective focused on urban landscapes based in Dharavi and also in other places around the globe. And they have been our advisors since day one. And they also introduced us to Kruti Saraya, Shyam Kanle, and Puneet Baresha, who formed our core team on the ground, because Jorge and I were only there for a month, but the museum ran for another year, actually. So we believe that a new museum, the museum of the 21st century, shouldn't be defined by architectural glamour or by a powerful collection, even if it may have these. We think that a museum should be transparent, progressive, dynamic, and most importantly, encourage inclusivity. So creating a museum in a place like Dharavi, even if it's a temporary one or a nomadic one, is a provocation in itself. And we were really well aware of that since the beginning. Museum is a big word. It's a very Western and modern idea, but we chose it on purpose. Because to us, Dharavi proved to be the right place to reimagine what a museum could be, precisely because such an idea doesn't really fit within its context. So we could also start from scratch, because the concept of the museum didn't really exist in this area yet, but not because it wasn't necessary. So the project's experimental spirit precisely lies within the barriers it aimed to break. So when we arrived in Dharavi, of course we saw people struggling, but we also found thriving businesses and factories. There was a lot of craftsmanship, but also technology. We found schools, hospitals, hotels, restaurants, gyms, shops. There were churches, mosques, and temples. So we thought, if Dharavi would have a museum, what would it look like? Well, it would be colorful, it would be flexible, it would be informal, it would even be nomadic, traveling along Dharavi to interact with all these communities that exist within the neighborhood. And it would collaborate with local makers, providing them with the time, space, and resources so they could make objects that they wanted to make and showcase in this museum. So this is a map of Dharavi that we've created, of the people that we've interacted with during the first month. So it's from potters to embroiders and tailors and screen printers. And Dharavi is not so big. It's about 3 square kilometers, and it has 1 million inhabitants. And what is interesting about Dharavi is that when it started 70 years ago, it was just a very small settlement way outside of the city of Mumbai, but now it forms this micro-universe right in the city center. So of course the first question was, how do you introduce this museum or design platform into this complex framework? Well, we thought the best way would be on wheels. The same way thousands of different goods, from cell phones to samosas, are being sold here every day with push carts. So we asked to get a push cart, and when we had it, we asked a metal workshop to build a frame for our cart. So the museum could be protected, but also the walls could be deployed as an exhibition space. And the last step, we asked a local artist to create this sign that would identify the structure as a museum. And a couple of days later, we could open our first exhibition already. This took place in the transit camp area, and it featured all these ceramic objects that you can see here, but also products that we made with broom makers. And one of our main concerns about the project is that we really wanted to have a program that will deal with the local identity. So with stories people could relate to, but also make their own. When we arrived in Dharavi and started to meet people, we were really amazed by the huge amount of tea that gets consumed here. Every time you meet someone, you sit down together, the first thing you do is drink chai tea. And everyone has their own way to drink it, from a small cup or a glass, or even from a saucer like this lady here. And one thing is sure is that when handing it over, it will spill. And getting that precious chai back into your cup seems to be some sort of a national sport in Dharavi. So that's where we actually saw a really great design opportunity to work together with the Kumbarwada potters. Kumbarwada is the neighborhood where they all are settled, and to come up with new products, because chai is part of India's and definitely Dharavi's identity. And for us, it only made sense to start our exploration here. And in Kumbarwada, we also found potters Natalal Chauhan and Mitul Chauhan. They're father and son, and they're running this family business that already goes back 4 generations. And when we first met Mitul, he said, oh, of course, we can make anything you want. Just show us your drawings. But that was exactly the challenge. We didn't have designs. We wanted to create things together with them for what they found important to show. So we ended up creating dozens of different cups. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some with really big handles, other with small funnels or saucers. So form followed function, and function followed freedom. And that same freedom we also wanted to apply in the decoration. So as you can see here, we used all these funky colors and patterns. Well, and then there was this other object that got our attention. It's this water container that's used in many houses in Dharavi to filter and store fresh water. And we thought it could be very interesting to create new shapes based on this typology. But again, we didn't have to aim too far, because we were hanging out in the Chauhan's shop and we were surprised by the way the pieces were stored in this very small space. They were all stacked together. So together with the Chauhans, we were actually wondering if we could somehow kept on stacking them and come up with new shapes for these water filters. So that's how these 4 water containers were created using all these shapes that already existed in the workshop, but put together and then decorated again in these really bright colors. And the reactions to these containers were quite interesting, because people couldn't really believe that these were made in Dharavi. But again, the inspiration for the decoration came from Dharavi itself. Maybe from the outside, Dharavi and settlements alike, they seem gray and dusty, but actually every house and every corner is decorated with these bright colors. And as you might notice, the pieces resemble the work of postmodern Italian designer and founder of the Memphis movement, Ettore Sottsass. But what's actually really interesting to us is that Sottsass was, in his term, very heavily influenced by his many trips to India. So that fact, for us, brings this whole story in full circle. And when we came back to Amsterdam, we received this photo. And Mithu has started this whole new series of pots and water containers where he combined the more traditional forms with the collection that he created for the Design Museum Dharavi. And he's selling these now. And also, like I said, for this first exhibition, we worked with broom makers. Because these brooms you can see everywhere in Mumbai and Dharavi. But exhibiting these daily objects as part of the museum was quite a statement. Because broom makers are considered as one of the lowest costs in India. But we wanted to display these works of the broom makers next to those of the potters, so that we could show that creativity in Dharavi must be celebrated, no matter where it comes from. So with the broom makers, we not only created all these many different brooms in materials and different finishings, but we also wanted to think of new objects using the same techniques. So together with the broom makers, we were designing hand fans and a parasol, for example. And also part of our program, we invited local makers to the museum to run workshops so the visitors could learn more about their work. And especially the children in the neighborhood loved these workshops and are very excited to make some ceramics. But we also had a lot of international visitors as far as New York or Amsterdam. Here you see our museum's director, Shyam Kanle, talking with a group of students from the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. So actually our exhibition brought together locals, journalists, design students, researchers, but also curious Mumbaikers that never visited Dharavi. This was the first time they actually stepped in the neighborhood, which is really in the center of the city. So the diversity that we were trying to encourage wasn't only focused on the people that we worked with and the objects that we exhibited, but also on the audience itself. And we never really wanted to go out of Dharavi to show objects, so that people really had to come to the neighborhood and see it for themselves. But for the second exhibition, we had a completely different theme. As you might know, cricket is really big in India, and Dharavi is definitely not an exception. On every corner you can find a group of children playing the game, and when the national cricket team wins a game, fireworks are being lit in their honor. That's how big cricket is in Dharavi. So when we met local carpenter Sandeep, we asked him if he could make a cricket bat. It was something he had never done before, he said, but he was very willing to accept the challenge, but he didn't want to use new wood. Instead, he gathered old pieces of reclaimed wood from Compound 13, that's Dharavi's recycling district, and he transformed them in these cricket bats, and he even used the old patterns and details as new design elements. So getting a customized handmade cricket bat is something pretty cool, of course. So all of a sudden, everyone was really interested in Sandeep's work, as you can see here. So instead of displaying these objects only, we decided to host a cricket tournament where we could actually use them. So Sham put us in contact with the highly skilled embroiderers from the Muslim community in Dharavi to customize the uniforms, because we wanted to create a feeling of belonging among the players that would take part in this tournament. And instead of having the t-shirts in different colors for each team, we asked the embroiderers to sew on these beautiful elements on the polo shirts. And these polo shirts were also made in a small factory in Dharavi. Well, when we chose cricket as the main theme for this second exhibition, we did so because we were very inspired by how this game is being modified and reshaped to the streets of Dharavi. Anything close to a wooden stick would do as the perfect bat. Balls differ in sizes, the stumps are just painted on the walls, and the rules are bent again and again to adapt the game to the size of the chosen location. And what might be a great drive in a professional game, batting the ball out of the field's bounds, in Dharavi it means quite the opposite, because the batter is then actually out, because he lost the ball in between the rooftops, or even worse, he could have endangered a neighbor that was just cooking with their window open. So what street cricket symbolizes in Dharavi is actually the people's flexibility and ability to change and reinvent themselves on a daily basis. So we used 27 hand-carved cricket bats for the tournament, and the results were quite unexpected. Some of these bats, they broke after a couple of drives, but at one point players really started to pick up their favorite and only wanted to play with those. So as I said, for us it was very important that the objects that were displayed were also being used during the game. So we had the stumps, we had a trophy, but we also had these gloves, cricket gloves, that were made by a maker that normally makes safety gloves. So with this exhibition, we actually wanted to strip the museum from its idea of privilege, and we envisioned a museum that does not just collect and display objects, but also really gets involved into making its own collection, engaging with its local surroundings, and that invites the audience to participate. So after being there for only a month, but it felt way longer, we felt the need to compile all these lessons that we've learned from this project into a manual. And this is part of our idea to create some sort of a model that can also be implemented by anyone else in other similar places around the world. And we wanted to investigate how design could help create a stronger sense of identity for these places and their community. And we're quite excited to see how museums, academies, and cultural institutions adopt a more socially relevant role, where design methodologies and conversations are taking place in unexpected scenarios, with questions like, what is the importance of a design collection today? What will these collections, or how will these collections be perceived in the future? And could they maybe even evolve into something else? Is collecting and preserving artifacts enough for a museum to be relevant? Well, we believe that institutions can also really be involved in not only collecting and showing, but also in creating objects and narratives inside locations, promoting a more inclusive perspective. So using design as a means to empower communities and their work and their legacies. So supporting future generations of creative talent in a homegrown neighborhood will not only allow a greater cultural exchange and appreciation, we think, but we also believe it could actually increase the integration of these neighborhoods in the economies and societies of our future cities. Well, that was my my presentation. Thank you all, and yeah, we'll probably talk a bit more about it later.
Thank you, Amanda. That's a wonderful project. Yeah, I'm sure that we would have a lot to discuss, and we could draw out some commonalities as well in our discussion. Thank you. And Harriet, I pass the ball now to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Wessie. I'm sure there must be some kind of appropriate cricketing term for handing on, passing the baton, but I can't think what it is. What I would say is that following Amanda, who I first met in inverted commas in 2016, just before she and Jorge were about to stage the Mumbai exhibition, it creates a real link with some of the things that I want to talk about today. And I think I'm quite sure have gone into influencing the project that I'll talk about towards the end of this little 10-minute talk. But you'll see how that kind of connects in a minute. I'm just going to share my screen and get my slides up. Can you see this? Is this working?
Yes,
Perfect, Harriet.
this is working.
Okay, good. So I come to this, as Wessie mentioned in the introduction to us all, I teach on the interior design program at the School of Art, Architecture and Design. And it's still somehow slightly surprising to me that I work in a university. I spent the first, I guess, sort of 30 years of my career as a museum curator. But a comment that I want to make, and I think might be germane to our general discussions this evening, is that it's really only since I've been working in academia rather than as a curator that I've been able to think about Africa. Thinking about Africa, which was important to me because I was born in and spent early childhood in East Africa. So that kind of informed a lot of interests, was really quite difficult in the UK museum environment. And it is actually making the switch to working in a university and thinking sort of in scholarly academic terms about the museum environment that I've become more connected or more able to think about Africa, ironically. And for various reasons that I won't go into here because there isn't the time, although my primary connection is with East Africa, I've been working a lot on Southern Africa over the last few years. And I just in brief, I think one of the key drivers for that is that I'm very interested in politics and design, and Southern Africa, South Africa in particular, offers a perfect opportunity to think through those themes. So when Wessie asked if I'd come on board with this evening's seminar, I'd originally imagined that I'd offer you thoughts about the changing museological landscape in South Africa post-democracy based on existing writing. Making notes for this evening, though, I think I really felt that talking about the reimagined, restructured South African museum space might be more meaningful in terms of offering some personal reflection and sharing with you all the sorts of things that I've that bubble up in my mind, that I've come across, that I'm working with, and that I'm considering myself. And equally, for anyone who is interested in this, as you know, there's a great deal of material out there on the sort of South African museological turn, if you like. So something like Annie Coombs' History After Apartheid from way back in 2003, that feels like quite a long time ago. So that sort of work speaks rather better to the sort of those issues than I can here. But there is a lot of conversation about the museum world, museology, curating in South Africa post-democracy for all of you who are interested in that conversation. There's a lot there. Just go to JSTOR and there it is. But in brief, I think thinking about museum reorientation in South Africa since '94 and the arrival of democracy does engender a huge number of interesting and often hugely complex questions. So of course, just to kind of provide you with a landscape that I'm sure you already are aware of, but just to kind of recap, post 94, just the change in itself, the arrival of democracy occasioned the building of new museums, one of which, the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, still remains one of the most significant museums. And what's interesting, I think, about the Apartheid Museum to this day, although it documents the history of apartheid, it talks about the South African condition under apartheid and certainly doesn't pull its punches, which is, I think, a good thing. It also, there are installations and interventions, and I have a colleague who's a jeweler at University of Johannesburg, for example, who a couple of years ago staged an installation. So what is great about this new museum is its openness to considering all sorts of commentaries that think about being South African, being in South Africa nowadays, as well as in the past. And of course, from the arrival of democracy in 94, museums recognized that they were in a situation of entirely needing to rethink interpretation, content, display, all of this. There was a sort of need for it was felt, a wholesale rethinking. And I think psychologically as well, there was a sort of thinking about needing to divest of the past. But this particular slide that I'm showing you here, I've included it in this talk because it represents one of the most kind of notorious pre-democracy museum displays. Again, there's a lot written about this. It's the so-called Bushman Diorama that was first created in 1959 in the South African Museum, which is in Cape Town. It's no longer called that, but the South African Museum, it's important to note, is a museum of natural history. So the issue was clearly that you're describing a people in a natural history museum. Well, what was going on there? This display of the Khoisan Bushman was actually removed as I think it was about 2001, and the South African Museum is now part of the Iziko Museum's Cape Town. But this was the sort of issue that needed to be rethought. But there's more, I think, as well to the story than just simply thinking about rewriting the South African museum space. And one of the things that particularly interests me is that I'd argue that when broaching issues around decolonisation and decentering, this is presuming that we're thinking in terms of Euro-America as the kind of global curatorial centre. Then in the South African context, this is more complicated because prior to democracy, apartheid South Africa was decentered. World Pariah, when I was an assistant curator in the 1980s, global sanctions and the National Party's own politics of apartheid, i.e. separateness, affected not just the majority black population, but things like museological conversation, and divorced the nation from all sorts of conversations, amongst which museum practice, I think, was one. So 21st century South African museums have at one level then had to sort of travel in the opposite direction to institutions around the world for whom decentering has been important. And for a time, at least during the early days of democracy, there was an interest in traveling back towards the center. So as is so fascinating in the South African case, there's a kind of, there are different stories and there are complexities that I think need unpacking when thinking about the museum landscape there. And when I was writing these notes, something came to the front of my mind, which was, one of those chance conversations that you have that actually turn out to be really meaningful. And it was a conversation that I'd had, I think, in about 2008 in the check-in queue at Heathrow with an Iziko Cape Town museum's curator who was travelling home on her way back from a workshop at London Docklands Museum. And the workshop had been on decolonisation. So Iziko museums, and this is, I put this slide up to give you a sort of their kind of mission statement and an idea of what they're about. Iziko museums are made up of 12 separate museums and historic houses in Cape Town. And they'd felt that it was important to be present at the Docklands workshop, not at all to learn from the UK. So this wasn't a kind of looking back to the colony in that sense, or the colonial authority. It was about simply being able to take part in a conversation that hadn't been able to happen during apartheid. So it was an opportunity to rejoin, recenter, if you like. When we had the last of these seminars a couple of weeks ago, part of the third in this series, one of our colleagues, Chuksi, and I don't think he's here tonight, and I'm afraid I didn't manage to make a note of his surname, but he asked this very, very salient issue around coloniality, decoloniality. We were thinking about fashion textiles, and we were thinking about the South African context with our colleagues at the Institute for Fashion Research Africa in Cape Town. So Chuksi asked about, well, what about decolonializing the museum in South Africa? We were really way over time, so it wasn't possible to offer a response. And I kind of made a mental note that what I should do is bring that forward to today. So what I would have said, if there'd been more time, is, okay, let's have a look at the example of Zeitz-Mocker. Zeitz-Mocker, which is the building with these curious kind of lantern windows that you can see on the left of the image here. The Mocker in Zeitz-Mocker stands for Museum of Contemporary African Art. And as one of the world's largest galleries of contemporary art, it's an important indicator, really important indicator of reorientation in the museum world, that it's devoted to art by African or African diasporic artists. The Zeitz in the Mocker refers to Jochen Zeitz, its German founder. And as I'm sure many of you know, rather than employ an African or diasporic African architect to convert the original grain silo building in which the gallery is housed, Thomas Heatherwick was chosen as its architect. And very interesting, but very problematic. And in response, after 2 weeks, to Chuksi's question, that the gallery might look to Tate Modern in London as a model had been part of the original concept. It was something that the press seized on at the minute the gallery opened, but reading about, thinking about, talking to people about how and why Zeitz-Mocker ever came about in the first place, it was with the idea of Tate Modern that a lot of the thinking about Zeitz-Mocker was formed. So all these complications that I'm outlining now, I think have fed into and are particularly salient to my current research, which is to revisit Gavin Young's 1988 Art of the Townships. And this pre-democracy, as you can see by the date, was an important look at the sort of thing that Amanda's been talking about just now, actually, about the fact that we shouldn't exclude, we shouldn't write off, we shouldn't not think about art and design in the informal settlement. There's a lot that's there that can be said. Christine's talking about the irresistible vitality of art and design making in Africa absolutely struck a chord with me, because whilst Young in 1988 was able to talk about the art of the townships, boy oh boy, it's possible to do that now. And there is so much energy. And as you may know, Cape Town was the world design capital in 2014, and that could happen speaks volumes to just the amount of energy around sort of craft, design. And in the South African context, quite interestingly, there aren't the same hierarchies around craft versus design, which is something that I find quite useful and interesting and informative. So the project that I'm working on and I'm interested in comes off the back of my having worked with this group, Monkey Biz, which is a not-for-profit craft design group based in Khayelitsha, which is the biggest of Cape Town's townships, and set up by Mataps Ngaka and her mother Makatiso. It works with local women who work and produce these kind of crazy beaded animals that now sell in the Conran shop and in New York, Donna Karan, and in Selfridges and so on, and leave the bead artists who we work with absolutely staggered as to the sort of prices that they fetch. But that's a whole nother conversation. But off the back of this, I've come to know a lot, because Cape Town is in a way quite a small city. And I've come to know a lot of the craft design organisers, and I think that it's now time, almost 30 years since 1994 and the coming of democracy, it's now time to reevaluate Young's thinking about art in the townships, and this is what I'm working on with Mataps here. But the thought that I want to leave you with finally is the issue that Mataps always talks to me about and has to point out, which is that there is no word for museum either in Xhosa, which is the language that's most predominantly spoken in the Cape Town townships, or in Zulu, which is the language most prominently spoken in the Johannesburg townships. And these two words, this is the reason for this title that I had at the beginning, are a transliteration. So immuseum or immuseum are, as you can hear, a transliteration and sum up the situation around museology in contemporary South Africa in a quite interesting way. But if I'm working with people in the township for who there is no word for museum, how to go about this? And more importantly, what are the rights? What are the wrongs? What are the cultural understandings, misunderstandings, issues around who should curate what in the South African context? And all these issues, I think, feed into continually reorienting, never mind the museum, but my thinking, my mind, to the point of complete dizziness. So I'm kind of leaving you not with a nice, neat conclusion, but with a problem. But that's my talk, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Harriet. That's wonderful. That's precisely that we need to deal with all these questions and issues in each of our presentations. So that would just be a wonderful end with your presentation. Thank you. We're now going to have a dialogue among ourselves. I think the plan was that we will be having some conversations among us, and I did say that I want to ask questions and sharing, but rather engage in conversation rather than directing questions. So well, so instead of me talking, can I first invite the presenter to come on to the screen, so you can switch on your camera. So the four of us will be on the screen. Amanda and Christine.
I have my camera on.
Perfect. Right.
I think mine is on.
Christine.
Yes, Christine, I can see you.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Perfect. The audience to see us as pointed. That's the first time I use this collaborative device, so I wasn't terribly sure as well. Can I start by actually encouraging a burning question that we want to in relation to our presentation? Harriet.
Do I have a burning question? I think I don't know about our colleagues who've been listening to us, but I've been struck about the commonality of the issues. The fact that we face similar things, no matter where in the world we've been thinking about curatorial practice. And also maybe to bring to this, I guess it maps onto the idea that I kind of finished with there, which is one's in a way, or at least I find, I don't know the rest of you, and Amanda and Wesley and I began to have this conversation last week. Christine, unfortunately, wasn't free at the time, so wasn't part of the conversation. But we talked about we shared our sort of sense of identity. Where are we from? Who are we? How do we identify in terms of ethnicity? And talked about, broached on something which I think is part of this conversation, which is this feeling of belonging or not belonging. And I think this is really, it's something that I think about all the time in terms of my own practice, both academic and curatorial. I've just started working with the Africa Centre, and they have been hugely welcoming. And yet I have such imposter syndrome. I can't tell you. It's very difficult. Anyway, so that's just an observation, I think, really, rather than anything else. And I can see from the chat that there's a comment come in for
Amanda.
Amanda. Shall I read it out? Does that help? I don't know if you can see that, Amanda. Did you encounter problems when using Western concepts as museum for supporting local practice? Were local people interested in their daily life presented as museum content? I see a connection to using the Western fashion system idea in my museum to looking at other ways of dressing and styling as fashion, so using a colonial concept to decolonize. So that maybe, and there's a second question, but maybe I'll leave that bit with you just now.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Dan. Well, when we started this process, of course, we didn't just go there and said, hey, we wanna make a museum. So what we did, we first talked with Matthias and Rahul, who are based in Dharavi, and with Sham Kanle, who is born and raised in Dharavi. So we were really having all these conversations, because I think that's very important to really see. And then we also asked just people that we saw in the streets, but also the people that we worked with. We asked them, like, what do you think if we say museum? What is your perception of that? And they actually, what they were very interested in is not per se the word museum or whatnot, but more that there was something where they could showcase their work, because they were very proud of it. And I think there's also all these systems in place that we don't even know of, because the potters that we worked with, the Chauhan family, they make objects that are shipped as far as Dubai. but we don't even know that, and people in Mumbai themselves also don't know that they're eating from things or whatever that are made in Dharavi. So the people that we were working with, so the potters, the broom makers, the embroiderers, they were very interested to have the time and space to also sort of experiment and yeah, show their work. And also the Chauhan family, the potters, they said, well, we are running this family business for 4 generations now, but Mitul's children were not per se that interested in furthering this business. But then because we did the workshop in the neighborhood, people came to them. It's like, okay, could I work with you? So I think that was also a very interested thing. And what you're saying, yeah, I find it also very interesting to talk about design. When we talk about the museums, like, well, the National World Cultures Museums here in the Netherlands, where we normally see the objects that are displayed there as folk art. But yeah, why isn't not? Why couldn't it be designed? Because it is designed by people.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, that's certainly a very good point. Well, your project is actually taking design as a sort of social tool to dissect as well as challenge forms of museum practice, as well as the hierarchy of art and design. And the way that you choose design is also one way to challenge that social hierarchy of art, between art and design. So I wonder whether this is also your deliberate choice of design in India rather than craft. I mean, how would you, because wherever we think about India, then this craftsmanship comes into play. And there's a lot of activities now is also drawing on the sustainable craftsmanship and drawing into part of this ecosystem of the design cycle. So how would you, I mean, how would you sort of take on these needs of design in the Indian context?
Well, what I've seen is that craftsmanship, of course, is still very much alive and it's really thriving. But most of the time, the people that are working, the craftsmen themselves, they remain anonymous. And you can also see that in architecture in India, there's lots of anonymous architects. And I think that's the change that design can make, that they actually see themselves as someone and people see them as someone, and people that actually have a name. And that's why we wanted to make this platform, so we can give the people a face that make the objects that are used all over the world.
Right. I'm also, well, I know that I jump into Anne's questions, and I'm obliged to ask the second questions of hers. So obviously it's about sustainability of the museum. When you, which is an often heard critique on NGO, for example, what happens when the outside stimulator has left. So that's how this of itself.
Yeah, so this is a question we had a lot, of course, but Design Museum Dharavi was basically an experiment, a project that was only supposed to last for 2 months. And because there was so much interest in the neighborhood itself, it lasted for a year, which was amazing. But then, of course, also the raining season started, and then life just changes in Dharavi, because normally life is way more outside, but then people go inside. And it's also hard because the alleys are quite small. There's not much space to store things. So the museum as a structure became a bit of a problem as well. So we said, well, that we would be fine if the neighborhood would come up with an idea how to use the structure. So what we've heard after a year, it was first used as a library, so a traveling library, which I really loved. And then another person took over and it became a mobile ironing station. So I think that's also really great. But so yeah, the stimulus might have left. But for example, that's why I wanted to show the photo that Mitul sent us, that he is now also really creating other products that he's selling all over. So the museum as itself might not exist, but the idea is still there.
I'm just going to come in here. Wessie, are you here? are you here, Wessie? I just missed you, so I was going to step in to help out in case you had a bad connection.
I think my connection is quite bad, so please go on.
Okay. Well, so I have a question that's popped up from our colleague Matthew. Matthew, maybe rather than I read it out, would you mind just coming on and talking us through your question, please?
Yeah, hello, can you see me?
We can. Hi there.
I've got my headphones on today to look like a airline co-pilot. Yeah, no, this is really a very broad question, and as is inevitably the case with these kinds of presentations, there's so much to grasp. What I have written is that the challenge of such an ambitious topic is that its scope does become unwieldy, this huge thing about the Global Museum. And I think that Harriet brought that nicely into focus at the end, which is that many of these environments, whether in the South Africa Museum, which is trying to tell a story about who we are and where we come from, or at the V&A looking at items that might be very personal and precious, items of adornment or that you might, or keepsakes, are attempting to deal with these very personal questions and also these huge issues of, you know, what is culture for you or for me? So these are questions that really matter. And I think it was useful that Harriet mentioned that scope in terms of especially the theme of belonging. Belonging and identity and culture. So sometimes they become heartbreaking questions, especially around issues that are controversial. And I was wondering how our speakers think about the challenge of navigating between those scales, the generalized scope arising from the challenge of display or the idea of the international visitor. And then at the same time, the difficulty of treading carefully around individual sensitivities or the desires of people to see themselves in the work. And that also might touch on the ethics of custodianship when you're dealing with issues that are like a lot more sensitive sometimes than the museum's brief, and that are heartfelt for your audience members. And sometimes what you're doing is putting those sensitivities on the scale, on display for a kind of international tourist. And you certainly find this at the Zeitz-Mocha in these slightly uncomfortable ways. So it's a very open question. I'm aware it's too big, but just to prompt discussion.
No, it's I could speak, but I'd rather let colleagues speak, because otherwise I'll just charge in. So please, you guys go ahead.
Christine, are you there? I think that's good questions to address your paper in relation to how questions of belongings and these identity could actually unfold in the Africa fashion exhibition, especially with these very stringent museum framework that you are working in, and the challenge of the multiplicities of the African subject.
It is a broad question, and it's quite a tough one to answer in some ways, because I feel that the approach that I've taken, the approach that we've taken, and very much being led by the African creators on the continent, is to do this kind of almost a dance between the broad sweep and the survey style show. I mean, the story that we want to get across is actually about abundance. It's about abundance and unbounded creativity. So in a way, the story we're trying to tell is quite a simple one, because we realize we can't drill down into key issues in that environment. We can drill down into issues through the book or through the events programs, through discussions and debates. But what people will get, or what people will experience when they come to the show at first glance, is this glimpse of the glamour and politics of fashion. So we talk about consciously celebrating the fashion scene. So the politics will be there and woven into it, but it's very much curated from a first-person position. And yes, the multiplicity is there, and there is this idea of the multiplicity of African voices and perspectives, but we're not engaging in any kind of comparison to global North fashion systems. We're absolutely being guided by what we see on the continent. And that's how we're managing, I think, to do this in a sensitive way and in a conscious way. So you won't find me speaking about decentering, and you won't find me speaking about decoloniality, or I don't decolonize anything, because for me, in decentering and decolonizing, I'm putting the colonizer back in the room. And so for most of my work, all of my work, before coming to the V&A, and I kind of brought this to the Africa Fashion Exhibition, is to put that down, put that comparison down, put that double consciousness, if you like, to one side. And I center Africa, and I center that multiplicity of voices. But our visitors will experience this glimpse, because you can only do a glimpse. It's such a vast topic, right? So you get this glimpse of glamour and politics, and then within that you will hear individual stories, a variety of individual stories within the actual exhibition. So it is this kind of this back and forth, this ebb and flow between the big sweep, the big survey, the larger scope of the exhibition, and then the individual stories. And that's the tactic, if you like. And I don't even think it is a tactic, because I think it comes actually out of my own experiences of doing the daily dance, of being a person of colour and being read in particular ways, and having come out of the fashion industry. And I'm new to museums, so all I can do is bring what I've learned through fashion industry, through the arts, through working in academia. That's what I bring with me. And that's really been my guide alongside what I hear and what I learn from the creatives on the continent.
I think that in practical terms, as curators, an approach that we have, which is fantastic in the museum context, is the different levels of interpretation, so that we can deal with some of this through the immediate labeling that people see in a gallery space. Then there's a sort of next level, which is a sort of short guide to an exhibition. Then there's the catalogue, and then there's the conference. So I think that just in practical terms, never mind the rest, those kind of levels and layers of interpretation are on our side in that sense. But that's just a kind of practical curatorial answer to the question.
I agree. I agree. That's exactly what we're doing. So it can be experienced in different ways and at different levels. You can drill more deeply into certain things. Yeah.
On a tactical point of view, how could we deal with an exhibition on Africa, on fashion, but without having the glamour of fashion overwhelm the politics of it? Oh, that's a question for Christine.
Sorry, I couldn't. You were breaking up quite badly. Sorry.
Okay, I was just wondering technical questions about how to deal with the overwhelming power of fashion over the politics, the essence of the politics in the show.
Well, I think the topic demands both. You know, I think that fashion, clothing, self-styling, self-presentation, it's a serious business across global Africa. And because of the racialized visual field, you can't divorce politics from the elegance and the glamour. You know, and within the exhibition, some of the creatives, they just want to make beautiful clothes. Other creatives, their work is absolutely infused with this with this sense of trying to define their own cultural identities, for example. And I feel that sometimes there is the temptation of falling into an either or, And I try to operate in this middle ground. You know, one of the texts that I come back to time again is Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands, because I recognize that as a curator, as a creative person, it's where I want to be. And I think it comes out of my Caribbeanness, this idea of the borderlands, this in-between space where it's not either or, it's both and this dance that I do, I think it comes from that. And I have to recognize that for some of the creatives that I'm working with on this exhibition, they just want to produce glamorous fashions. So they themselves are not taking themselves out of the haute couture system, if you like. And we have to, I think, allow African creatives to make that choice. It's not really for me to say, hang on a minute, you're exoticizing yourself by joining the fashion system of the global north. So for me, it's absolutely about giving our audiences a sense of the diversity and the tension between the different motivations that different practitioners have, differing motivations, differing aesthetics. Some people that absolutely want to be showing at Paris in a Paris couture show, others that would take for the hills. Sooner do that than be part of a show in Paris. So this question of glamour is, how are we defining glamour? How are we defining elegance? Can we expand those terms so there is space for someone that's working with local artisans? I loved Harriet. I'm not familiar with Monkey Biz, and I'm definitely going to look them up. So, you know, can the notion of glamour and elegance and beauty be expanded in such a way that it can include something that's handcrafted? And handcrafting, of course, is the definition of couture. So it's about, for me, it's stretching and expanding some of these terms and troubling people's expectations. And I think I do that because of this, you know, this in-between diasporic, creolized existence that I've experienced all this time, and it's powered up all of my research to this date. And I think I weave that into the way that we're working on this particular exhibition.
That's very interesting, Christine. In just immediate, quick response to that idea about the handcrafted and the couture, we worked very briefly with the British footwear designer Emma Hope, who wanted beaded kind of additions for her footwear. But we decided that actually this was not a conversation we wanted to have, and it took us too far from anything that was meaningful to Monkey Biz as an outfit. But it was a really interesting experiment. And I think, following on from probably what we've all been saying, maybe the way to de-racialize this to an extent is just to say that motives for doing the things that we're doing and for exhibiting, when you were talking about glamour and not wanting to intervene and sort of say, but do you not realize you're exoticizing, then the motives for making the things that people are making globally are the same and a mess wherever we're looking at, whoever we're talking about. And why should it be any different in Dharavi or in Lagos or in Cape Town or in London? You know, we're just a complicated, messy species, Homo sapiens, and so maybe we need to recognize that actually different people aren't necessarily going to have different motives. They're going to have the same messy motives as we all do.
I think that also reacts to the points about agency, and I think that's also something Christine mentioned about the story of agency, where through these exhibitions we can draw on the very different messiness, the chaos of creativity, and also could do the foresight, and that somehow rings true to also the context of Amanda's project as well in museum, in the Dharavi Museum, in a way that you are bringing in you're bringing in your ideas. You also have a tremendous co-creating practices with the local communities to cultivate what's meant to be and put it in this so-called design exhibition. Apart from how could you know from having this project? I mean, the Indian context is very unique, and now you're working in Amsterdam in a space which is very structured and has its own history. So, how did you the with your current work?
I'm sorry, Wes, you were breaking up there quite a bit, and I couldn't hear you the last question you were asking.
Right, I was is really about what did you take back home from the Dharavi project in your current setting? Vis-a-vis, I mean, this is very, I mean, the Dharavi project is something which perhaps you have more free hand, whereas this museum that you're situated has a long history and also have a very rigid protocol. So, so that would be the questions of how you kind of operate in this current setting.
Yeah, of course. It's a funny one because I was always a freelance curator playing outside. I made exhibitions in a parking lot in Eindhoven or in a palace in Marrakesh, and I could always, yeah, sort of do what I wanted. And now I've been working at the Stedelijk for a bit more than a year. So also a very strange year, of course, to come in a museum during Corona times, and we've already been closed for 6 months, and hopefully we're really opening this Saturday. So, but what I've learned, well, and I was, as you heard me speak, or maybe some text that I've written, I was always sort of kicking against maybe the walls of the institution. And I think now I'm working from the inside. You can see what museum time means. I think it all goes a bit slower. But I think the whole idea of having these sort of fresh ideas and trying to break down walls, I definitely took with me. And maybe also in not only in showing, displaying objects, but also in the projects that I would like to show. For example, the first project that I really wanted to show was a project that was all about the Peacock Chair. You might know the rattan Peacock Chair. And this was a project by Mona Alcudia. And actually, through karaoke, you are sitting on this chair, and she changed the lyrics of really well-known songs like Kokomo or We're Going to Ibiza. And through these songs, she was telling the history of the Philippines, because she's from the Philippines, that it is a design country and that it's not only cheap manual labor that can come from there. And that's something I wanted to bring in the museum. So yeah, people would actively partake in singing, and while singing you would learn something. So also this, how can you have different ways of sharing knowledge, that I would like to really take into the museum. And of course, the Stedelijk Museum also has different projects already in place where we go into different neighborhoods and try to ask people what they want to see and they want to know from the museum. So I think that's really helpful for me, and I can learn from that.
Great. Yeah, I can see like you and Christine are breaking walls now that you are both coming into a very rigid space. So it is wonderful ideas where you're bringing your belief into your belief and also your these very imperial space. And certainly, I was also wanting to think about what kind of I mean, how would you navigate authority and sort of rigidness of some of those management level that allows you to experiment what you wanted to experiment? How can you break free with some of the things that goes through your ideas and make it out to the public?
That's a really good question. Maybe Christine, you want to answer this one?
It's a great question. I think that It's quite hard to answer, because I feel that someone once described me as someone with I think it's steel fist and a velvet glove. So I think that's probably my way of doing things. I think as a practitioner as well, there's a kind of within the V&A, there's a real warmth towards creativity and the voices of practitioners. So I feel that that's on my side when I come with my ideas. And I realize as well, I don't do an awful lot of asking. I just kind of do things, and then people catch up around me. But it comes from really being in this new world and not really knowing how things are supposed to be done. I just have ended up doing things in the way that I know best, the way that I've experienced, and so far people kind of come along. So I don't know how else to answer it. Then there must be, but other than I think I'm a great, I like to speak to people, and I'm a great listener. So a lot of what I'm doing is talking, and I share my ideas with people, but there's an awful lot of just doing as well, if that makes sense. Amanda, I'm sure you'll have a much more useful answer than me to that question.
Not per se. I think what you're saying, like, instead of trying to fall into the systems that are in place at the big museum, just try to hold on to, you know, your own spirit. But I think I'm very lucky that I was hired in a time where the Stedelijk also knows that it wants to change, and you can really see that reflected in the staff that is hired, in these sort of positions like mine, but also in other curatorial positions. So I think that's really good. So I think the museums are also really realizing and acknowledging that a change is needed. So that means for us that we have a bit more freedom in doing things.
But it is a fight. Just to briefly answer as well, I know Matthew has his hand up, but I would offer an experience that I had when I was a curator at the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts. So this is this beautiful gallery at the University of East Anglia, designed by Norman Foster and Foster Associates. Still, you know, from what you drink your coffee out of, to the chairs, to the everything, it's very, very much under their aegis. But we were offered an exhibition called Japan, Kingdom of Characters, which I was given the job of curating, which was about anime. And I said, look, if we're doing this, then we need to put our money where our mouth is. And if we're going to have a huge, we had about a 4-foot high Hello Kitty, and I can't remember all the names of all these things, but there were plastic sculptures all over the place. And I said, you know, if we want to attract a new audience, then we can't foster this. You can't just make it a grey Norman Foster aesthetic. We have got to do something different. So I said, we need to have pink walls, I'm sorry, and we need to have a Hello Kitty bedroom. And everyone hated it. But it brought in a new audience for those few months. So I think you kind of pick your battles, and you just have to. And also, when I ran Willow Road for the National Trust, I said, we can't have National Trust Bembo. We have to use Gill Song for our publications. And I was nearly kind of excommunicated for that. But again, you know, it's just, if you want to do these things, then the museum has to back you. You can't do it in a mealy-mouthed kind of way. The National Trust made us huge hurrah about having a modern movement property in its portfolio, but weren't prepared to follow through. So, you know, I think sometimes that it's up to us, as you guys have been saying, to fight. So sorry, I know Matthew had a question.
Yeah, Matthew, and yeah, the 3 firefighters, by the way.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think that these threads that have been picked up are really interesting, and my field is maybe closer to Amanda's in that I'm an urbanist. I'm not a fashion designer or a curator at all. But that phrase, the right to the city, is really important to urbanists everywhere. And for me, that's also about not always having to play by the rules, but also the theme of having the keys to the city and being able to run around and feel ownership over it, and at the same time being a citizen, is a good one. And I love this idea of the right to glamour, which Christine seems to be reminding us of, that you should be able to, you know, wear silken pearls if you want to, but, you know, whatever makes you feel at your best. And I think that that theme about being able to have the freedom to just want to say yes to the dress, sort of thing, is also a part of an institutional critique, and that there are attitudes, especially if you are inside the institution, the idea of who you can commission can be part of that. And there are two current examples that I'm just going to really briefly mention because I've been talking to them both this week. The one is to do with the Royal Academy, and one of my colleagues who we all love, who is fantastic, is Bob and Roberta Smith, who is an artist who manages to be inside the institution, and mostly the Royal Academy, where he's an academician, and yet at the same time his artistic practice kind of breaks down the institution while also allowing the institution to see itself again. I tried to get in touch with him today. He's in the car on the way to Preston, where he's covered the front of the gallery in this huge sign all about, you know, how art can save lives and artists need to make things to change the world. And then the other one, I just wrote an article which went live today about the new Serpentine Pavilion, which is being designed by Counterspace this year. And at the heart of Counterspace is this young Muslim Johannesburg woman called Sumaya Valley, who is kind of fronting her whole approach to this year's Serpentine kind of proudly through the kind of theme of sensitivity and being vulnerable and allowing that to be who she is, rather than the defiant and young and then kind of going to change the world. And yet she is changing the world in this way, which is not institutional at all. So I think I think that institutions, when they have the right commissioners and curators, and of course Hans Obrist is the most extraordinary curator at the Serpentine, they do have this capacity to really help the institution to step outside of itself. So it's a gift. Not so much a question, just some thoughts.
No, thank you for that. I'll definitely. That sounds so interesting. I'm really keen to find out more about the pavilion, the artist that's created that. So thank you for that. Really, really helpful.
Whether any of you have a last question, audience. We have quite a number of audience with us, and so I just wonder whether we could hear some of the audience feedback. Anyone want to ask some questions or a comment to give to our 5 guests tonight? We had Sky, who wanted to respond to Harriet and Matthew's conversation in relation to fitting in and imposter syndrome, and having talked to artists with dyslexia like himself, often not fitting in can take many different forms. And Sky, would you be able to bring yourself up, switch on the camera to tell us a little bit more about that? Sky, have you switched on your mic?
Perhaps I can speak to that while Sky responds or finds the mic or something. I think in a way, Sky, no, I completely understand what you're saying, and I think there are a huge number of us, I think, in the museum world and certainly in the art school who are dyslexic. We might just have lost Sky, maybe trying to connect, but nevertheless, in response to this, and I think that in terms of my own sort of questioning about this sort of imposter syndrome and so on and so forth, I think there's a very fine line between being aware and sensitive to thinking about, you know, you don't want to just sort of steam in. Hi Sky, yes. So I'm just kind of responding to your comment while we're getting you on board. But after a while, too much imposter syndrome actually becomes very self-indulgent and very pompous. So it's a real kind of, and then maybe that's me overthinking it again, but, you know, it almost comes across like faux humility. So whilst I recognize that you know, this is something that I battle with, and I think, okay, so I really want to work on Africa. I really want to think about things African across the continent. And that holds forth, and it's a passion and it's a motivator. There are moments when I think I need to be questioning this, but at the same time, too much kind of proclaimed self-doubt, and it's just, as I say, it's just pompous, and it comes across as faux humility or faux something. So I think there's a very fine line to tread there. I don't know if that makes sense, and I don't know what the others think, but that's my sort of position on that.
I know that Sky is coming back, and Sky, would you like to switch on your mic or the camera a bit more about your question?
Thank you. Sorry about that. I was using my phone and I couldn't figure out how to put myself on, so I took myself. So yeah, well, I was just thinking how, you know, it's in terms of neurodiversity, you know, and how this not fitting in, how complex that is, really. So that's the point I was making.
And Sky, you kind of mentioned dyslexia. Is that the sort of thing that makes you feel like an outsider, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's quite common that, having talked with other artists with dyslexia like myself, quite often there's this, you know, particularly in academia and higher education, this imposter feelings, you know, of not in, regardless of anything else.
I completely identify with that, and I think that in the British education system we've done so badly in the past, thinking about something like dyslexia, that hasn't helped. On the other hand, I taught for a while at the Royal College of Art, and something like 75% of the student and staff body was dyslexic. Because, I mean, this is getting into another conversation, but in creative practices, that's what we often tend to be. So there's an interesting thing going on there about being outside or inside or whatever, but I completely recognize what you're saying.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. It's really interesting discussion.
Good.
Thank you. I've also seen a hand from Yaset. Would you like to come forth, Yaset?
One sec. Hi there. Let me just see if I can switch on my camera. Oops. Yes, I think. Sorry, I'm not used to using Collaborate. I just wanted really to echo what others have said. This has been an incredible discussion, and so there's no question, but just to say how important this is, and to have 4 completely different perspectives. It just shows how the topics of, as we said, as you said before, ideas of decentering happen in so many ways across, in ways that we can see across disciplines, across cultural references, and it's just really inspiring to see these perspectives together, because in a sense they show the we're talking about one topic, but we're also showing how this topic is incredibly varied, and so it certainly can never be pinned down to one approach, to one strategy. So I think being able to hear from a wealth of strategies is really, really inspiring. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, for these comments. That's great. I don't know whether any of you want to respond to it, and certainly, well, we are already demonstrating some multiplicity in our own approach, even with the presentation. So that's a very prominent feature. Christine or Amanda, do you want to respond to that?
I don't see Christine at the moment. But I'm really happy that we're here with the four of us, exactly with our different approaches. And of course, I can talk also a lot about my work at the Stedelijk, but of course there's no time for that. But I definitely see how whatever we are learning from our own backgrounds, how we can, sort of change the system of the institutions.
Yeah, and I think that maybe whilst we have different approaches, I think that one thing that is common is this idea of open-endedness and possibilities and plurality. And I always want to come back to one of the images that you showed us, Amanda, where it was the museum, but it was a museum without walls. And I was thinking it's rather like an open palm. And I feel that we were all describing this approach that's kind of like an open palm, if you like, which I think there's a real beauty to that.
That's really beautiful, yeah, definitely. Yeah, we have, like at the Stedelijk, I don't know if you don't know the building, but we have this really big glass facade. So you feel sort of already part of the city, and then in front of it is, and I think that lots of modern and contemporary museums have this, it's the best space for skaters to do their thing. And I'm always just thinking, like, how can we get them in the museum, like how, so actually there was a performance by skaters in our entrance hall. So I think the openness is very, very important, and the transparency, yeah.
Open arms for embracement. I think that's a very good way to end the session, but also as a takeaway for the sessions, just because we are promoting and demonstrating diversity and plurality that we all talk about, and I think we would like to certainly hear more of your project, Amanda, and your kind of owns project that you are and Christine, your exhibition is going to come up next summer, so that would be something that we all need to put down in our diary. We very much look forward to that and see the glamour in the politics and vice versa. And Harriet, great for this context of South African, and also help us to rethink and reimagine of the South African museology. I know that is one thing that we haven't discussed. The museum being decentre. Am I lost or sorry?
Yes, we lost you slightly there, Wessie.
Okay, is that no?
No, not. I'm not. It's breaking up quite badly at the minute.
Without torturing everyone, perhaps we would end here. Otherwise, well, it would be a nightmare to be joined up again. But we're also heading to the. We're also ticking the clock. So I want to thank. If you can still hear me, I want to thank Amanda, Christine, and Harriet for this very stimulating discussion and your presentation. Very engaging research. and also your project. So a round of applause to you, all of you. And last but not least, I would also like to thank the audience for joining us. The recording of today's forum will be made available, and you can find it by clicking on our Creature Past Events tab. You will find this series also today's event. Now, please also check out future Creature events on our website. Reorienting Cultural Creativity will continue the next academic year, so do watch. And now, have a very good evening, all of you, and bye for now.